Okay, so I've seen a lot of people not talking about what's happening in Mandera, and I've seen also a lot of people not understanding what exactly is the cause of what's happening right now in Mandera. Because if you haven't checked the news, okay, not it isn't actually any news. Okay, if you've checked in social media, you've probably seen reports of a bomb going off in Mandera that was actually set off by the government of Somalia, by the Somali forces, and it's because they were countering Jubaland forces that are apparently in Mandera in Kenya, right? So what exactly is the background to what is happening right now in Mandera? Like, what is the background of the fighting between Jubaland and Somalia? Who exactly is Madobe? And why are they fighting because of an election? Now, let's look into the background of all this. Now, I won't go deep into the whole history of Somalia because that is a very big issue, but I want to start where the relevance now starts to come in this entire system. And it starts in 1991. Why? Because in 1991 the dictator Siad Barre was actually ousted by the clan members inside Somalia, right? He was a dictator who was ruling Somalia for a very long period of time, and now he was ousted by the clan members in Somalia. Now, after that ended up happening, the Somali government collapsed. After the Somali government collapsed, the clan members who ousted the government, they weren't able to actually form one unified government. So they started fracturing within Somalia itself. And this became such a very massive humanitarian issue because of the destabilization that it caused within Somalia. And even the United Nations and even the United States itself now started coming into Somalia. But the problem is the militias that sprang about from that entire system. And that's how the militias, you'll see how the militias now tie into Jubaland and the issues that are currently in right now. Now, during that period, these clan members, these clan officials, they now started forming their own sort of autonomous regions within Somalia. You get, they are these militias, they were backed by a lot of foreign players, and one of the most dominant foreign players was obviously the United States. It backed a lot of militias within Somalia because they wanted to take a hold of majority of the profits and resources that were coming from Somalia. And if you're thinking about oil or whatever, it wasn't predominantly oil, it was more of strategic position. Why am I saying that? Because a lot of the ports in Somalia were extremely helpful, but not only that, they were also going there for strategic reasons to defend their trade deals. Why am I talking about the trade deals? Because it's usually at this point in time that we start to see the whole concept of Somali pirates coming into the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Now, for those of you who don't know, after the Somali government collapsed, a lot of people now started going into stealing, you get, to survive. And one of the most lucrative places to steal was actually the Gulf of Aden, because around 25% of the trade that actually goes to the world, that is actually done in the world, goes through the Suez Canal. Now, to go through the Suez Canal, you'll have to go through the Red Sea, and obviously you'll have to go through the Gulf of Aden. So you have to go through all this, and it's a very strategic position. And that is why the United States now started funding militias to, it started funding militias so that they can be able to gain dominance within the region, while at the same time it was actually sending its own troops to counter the stealing that was happening in the Suez Canal and the Somali pirate situation. You get? Now, in all this, all this, what ends up happening is that some clans now start to pick a lot of Islamic ideologies, because they were starting these clan members were actually experiencing a lot of how do I call it? They were actually experiencing a lot of bad governance from the militias that were ruling them. So they now started diverting their attention to basing some kind of ruling based on Islam, right? So they started forming Islamic courts within these clans and these militias. Now, these Islamic courts, they now started gaining a lot of prevalence and popularity within the region because a lot of the people in that region were Muslims. And what ended up happening is that in this entire situation, these Islamic courts, they now boomed in number. And later on, around in, I think it was in 2000, close to 2000, still in the 1990s, they now started, not even 1998, before 1998, around mid 1990s, they now formed the Islamic Courts Union, which was like an autonomous government that was now within Somalia, that united these courts under one banner, right? And now these courts, they are now starting to grow in prevalence within Somalia. Now we get to 2000, where the United Nations and the US government, and also a lot of Western supportive governments, they now start to push for a motion to actually bring about a stable government within Somalia. So you know what they end up doing? They now go to Djibouti, and they actually now build a forum to create a transitional national government within Somalia. Now now this transitional government, one of the deals of this transitional government, they actually selected a president which was obviously backed by the United States, and actually came from, he was actually backed from the United States, by the United States. And this president was to be the president of Somalia for the next 3 years, before now they start to take full power of Somalia. It was supposed to be at like a transitional government, right? Now, what ended up happening with this transitional government? It failed. It failed miserably, and it failed by around 2004. The talks of a stable government in Somalia was now going down, and now the talks of the ICU gaining prevalence was now going up. Now the ICU now was getting to a point where it was now ruling massive parts of southern Somalia, to the point that it was ruling more territory than the official recognized government in Somalia. So it was already a messed up situation. And in the ICU, remember, it was multiple courts. The ICU now started developing a lot of branches and also a lot of wings in it. Now the thing is, whenever you have like massive organizations, there's always going to be moderate people that are usually just like not extreme, and there's obviously going to be extremist people within the entire concept, right? Now the ICU wasn't an exception. It had moderates, like for example a guy called Madobe, and Madobe is a very important person whenever you look into very recently in Somalia, and he's basically one of the reasons as to why there's fighting between Jubaland and Somalia right now. Now Madobe, he ended up actually, he was a very senior commander in the ICU, right? He was also a very moderate person. But then there were extremists within the ICU, and one of the extremists, we know them today as a very well prescribed terrorist organization known as the Al-Shabaab. Yes, and also if you didn't know, Al-Shabaab literally translates to the youth in English. So if you're a youth, being called Al-Shabaab is actually a direct translation to what you call yourself. So there's that. Now, what ended up happening is that after the transitional government failed in Somalia failed in 2004, the United States and also its allies now went to Kenya, and they now formed a new transitional federal government. They started looking at the point where Somalia, trying to make a unity within Somalia was extremely hard, right? Historically. So they wanted Somalia to try out a federal system of government. Now, for those of you who don't know what a federal system of government is, look at the United States. The United States, we have the main government of the United States, and we also have different states within the United States that have their own government, they have their own leaders, they have their own constitutions, they have their own flags, they have their own systems, and they can also bring about, they have their own constitution essentially, and they act as singular states, but they're still under the United States government. That's what a federal state is essentially. So they were now championing for Somalia to adopt a federal state system, right? Now, they adopted this, but now still the ICU was still getting a lot of prevalence in the region. And now we get to 2006, when the ICU did something that nobody expected, is that they took control of the capital of Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, Mogadishu. And once they took control of this entire system, it was very prevalent that the ICU was going to get dominance in Somalia. Like the ICU was now going to take over Somalia. Like it was very prevalent at this point in time. And guess who was going to get pissed off about all this? It was Ethiopia. Now, you are asking, why exactly was Ethiopia getting pissed off about this? Because Ethiopia has a very long history with a strong unified Somalia. Yeah, there was a point in time where Somalia had this mission of Greater Somalia, trying to unite the Somali people in Djibouti, Ethiopia, and in Kenya. And they ended up invading Ethiopia during that period of time, and they were quashed very badly. Like, there was a massive war. Now, in this entire period, the Somali government started noticing that, okay, in Somalia and Ethiopia, there are certain tribes that exist in both countries, right? So, the tribes that were in Somalia, they was now starting to get a lot of prevalence through the ICU. And the Ethiopian government now started to see this as a problem because they saw it as an attack of their sovereignty, because the multiple tribes that are now in Ethiopia could now secede or could now be aiding the tribes that are now in Somalia. And what could end up happening? So Ethiopia could actually lose this territory that it was trying to keep the last time Somalia tried to invade them. So what ended up happening? Ethiopia, being aligned with the United States was now pissed off at this point in time because the ICU outstayed the leaders that the United States placed there as puppets, essentially. So Ethiopia united with the United States, and in 2006, they invaded Somalia. Yes, they invaded Somalia, and they actually outstayed the ICU and disbanded the ICU. They arrested Madobe and a lot of top officials in the Islamic Courts Union, and now they took these leaders and okay. So they took these leaders, they arrested the leaders, and then they were taken into solitary confinement in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, right? Now, in this period, ICU was disbanded, but one group wasn't disbanded. Which group is that? The Al-Shabaab. The Al-Shabaab now went underground, and they started coming back about as an insurgency because they now saw it as an attack to their sovereignty. When the United States disbanded the ICU, they now saw it as an attack on their sovereignty and as an attack on the dominance that they were now starting to gain in Somalia. So you know what they ended up doing? They built a lot of resentment against the United States. And which other Islamic force had a lot of resentment for the United States? The Al-Qaeda, which, by the way, was being funded by the United States initially before it now started going against the United States with Osama bin Laden and all that. Sindio, the United States has a lot of things that it has done in Somalia, and there were also some talks of like the United States backing the ICU. So at some point in time, the United States actually backed the Al-Shabaab. I think the backing also went to the point of around 2010, because in 2010 is where the first confirmed case of terrorist bombings actually was carried out by the Al-Shabaab on foreign soil in Uganda, actually. So it was because of all this that now the United States now started reducing its funding on the Al-Shabaab, and at some point it's said that it disbanded all the funding that it was giving to the Al-Shabaab, right? Or the ICU, essentially. So in this entire system, in 2000, there's something I forgot to mention. In 2009, this guy Madobe was now released from the Ethiopian prisons, and now when he came back, he did not try to reunify the ICU. He now wanted to just gain regional dominance in the region that he was born from, Jubaland, and he now gained a lot of relevance from the clan members in that area. And also there was the Raskamboni Brigade, which was still existing at this point in time, which was a faction of the ICU that was still existing at this point in time. And now he gained prevalence in the brigade, and now he became the commander of the brigade, right? So now, for good, okay, this is actually considered luck, but I don't know if there was like a previous influence before this actually ended up happening, but I consider it as strategic luck. Now, in 2011, a terrorist attack happened in Kenya, right? In Lamu, and a foreigner was murdered. Now, the Kenyan government actually wanted to maintain peace within Somalia. Now, what did they do? They went in contact with the Somali government, and they said that they were going to lead a peacekeeping mission to actually counter the influence of the Al-Shabaab. Now, Madobe took advantage of this entire situation and actually opened corridors for the Kenyan government, the Kenyan Defense Forces, to come into Somalia, specifically Jubaland, where the Al-Shabaab were being stationed. And the Al-Shabaab was actually how do I put it? The Al-Shabaab was actually operating the port of Kismayo, right? Now, Madobe wanted to take this wanted to take advantage of this so that he can gain prevalence again in this region. So what did he end up doing? He ended up banding with the KDF, and then they ended up taking out the Al-Shabaab from Kismayo. Now, after all this happened, Madobe now was placed by the Kenyan government in Kismayo. And you know what he did? He now declared in 2013 that heartburn. He now declared in 2013 that now Jubaland is now going to be an autonomous state within Somalia. Now, initially, this had so much backlash with the Somali government because they are the ones who are going, you cannot declare yourself as an autonomous state without having to how do I call it? Without any influence from the main government of Somalia, from the main government in Mogadishu. So you know what ended up happening? Kenya, along with a lot of member states under the IGAD, they actually went to Somalia and they caused Somalia to accept Jubaland as an autonomous state within Somalia. So you know what ended up happening? The Somali government actually ended up capitulating and they accepted the deal. Mostly because it was extremely helpful for them in terms of defense and the whole story of Al-Shabaab. But it was extremely helpful for the Kenyan government because now they had a leader that they was very supportive of that could, to some extent influence a lot of things that are happening within Somalia, but essentially in Jubaland. Although Madobe himself is not a madman, he's not akona akili, he is actually catering for the needs of the member clans in his autonomous state compared to the Kenyan government. Now, at this point in time, Jubaland actually has its own president, for those of you who don't know, and Madobe is the president. And they have their own elections, they have their own parliament, they have their own constitution. They're basically like a federal state. I've already explained what a federal state is essentially. So, in this federal state, whatever happened is that I'm not even reading from a script. This is all from my head, by the way. I just have to tell you that. So in Madobe, he now elections in Jubaland is actually 5 years, 2 terms of 5 years each, right? Now the first election Madobe obviously won, but this form of election was actually very shady. You know why? Because the form of election is a parliamentary election. Now, the parliamentarians in the parliament of Jubaland are the ones who are electing the president. So if the president has his own people in parliament, he can be elected very easily. It's not like here in Kenya where the people are now electing the president. Over there is the parliamentarians who elect the president, right? So obviously he was elected for his 2 terms, and his second term was supposed to end, I think, in 2023 or 2024. I think it was 2024. Now, after this entire situation, I think in 2024 or 2023, around there, apo katikati, around there, sindio? Now, what ended up happening is that Madobe said he was running for a 3rd term. And this was messed up, and it was all obviously against the constitution of Somalia. Not actually, against the constitution of Jubaland, yes. But the parliamentarians actually overlooked the constitution of Jubaland to allow him to run for a 3rd term, and he was actually elected into the 3rd term. Now, the Somali government was obviously against this entire situation because of what exactly was happening. So you know what ended up happening? The Somali government now called the elections unconstitutional, and the Jubaland forces, the Jubaland government actually saw this as an attack on their autonomy. So you know what ended up happening? The Somali government actually ended up sending Somali forces into Jubaland to now deal with the crisis in Jubaland and the fact that they haven't followed the constitution to the latter. Now, what ended up happening after this in 2024, going into 2025, right now in 2025, the forces of Jubaland and Somalia have been fighting because of this entire election process, this entire election scam. And now, Kenya has been involved in this entire system because the Somali government had actually found out that a lot of Jubaland forces members were actually going across the border between Kenya and Somalia, and they were mostly in Mandera. So you know what the Somali government actually ended up doing? There is now, to some extent, the fighting now started spreading to the border of Kenya. And now the Somali forces were actually starting to fight the Jubaland forces to some extent within the borders of Kenya. And now the recent bombing in Mandera, which is said to be attributed to the Somali government, is now coming into play. So this is why Jubaland and Somalia are fighting right now, and Kenya is now being dragged into this one because of the border disputes. Not actually the border disputes, because of the fact that we have a border between Kenya and Somalia, between Kenya and Jubaland, and also with the fact that the leader that is there is actually being backed by the Kenyan government, and also the other fact is that the Kenyan government is actually allowing Jubaland forces into Kenya. And that is why they're downplaying this entire story of why the major news sites are actually not talking about the bombings that are now happening in Mandera. Because if those things start to be talked about, people are going to start to know about what's happening in Somalia and Kenya's part in actually undermining the sovereignty of Somalia to some extent. To some extent, by the way. They still have certain ties with Somalia on its own, and things have been going great in terms of business and all that. But it's because of this issue of Jubaland that there are some tensions that come about every once in a while between Kenya and Somalia. And right now, we are starting to see it again, but the government is now starting to downplay it because they do not want the plans that they had set for Jubaland and Somalia to fail. They just don't want it to fail. So they're trying to minimize the news on what's happening right now. So yeah, that's what's happening right now between Jubaland, Somalia, and how Kenya is involved.